Okay, so in this presentation, I want to talk about explication as anti-philosophy. So the first question is, what is it an explication, and how we can define it as anti-philosophy? An explication is meant to result in an explicatum that's exact in contrast to the vague or inexact explicandum. That's to say, the task of making exact a vague or not so quite exact concept that's used in everyday life, like any folk psychological concept you could think of, or even a concept that's used in the earlier stages of scientific or logical development, or replacing it by a newly constructed, more exact concept. So the distinction between what can be called, the conceptual analysis or amelioration and replacement or engineering would be of crucial distinction for us for our discussion today. So you either simply transform a vague concept in hopes of retaining at least maybe partially a given explicandum, or you could simply give up the explicandum and come up with your own newly constructed or engineered concept. So for the sake of clarity, we call this two kind of explication: partial and full-fledged explications. Looking at another angle, what does it mean to be exact in this context, or exact in what sense, you can ask? The answer to this question, I think, can be found somehow as implicit in Karnap's writing. And I think the first indication of what amounts to can be found in the principle of tolerance. When Karnap says in logic there are no morals, everyone is at liberty to build his or her own logic and so on. And the reason why I think this can be called anti-philosophy is because what is rejected here is clearly are the philosophical arguments. What actually counts now for Karnap is only the precision of a given syntactic and semantic rules of the kind of logic which you are at liberty to construct, not the traditional philosophical arguments of philosophers or arguments of everyday discourse. And for Karnap, this is the only remedy which we can provide for the inconclusiveness and the infinite, what can be called, the infinite ambiguity of philosophical arguments and everyday discourse. Now, briefly, you can enumerate certain examples, as we discussed in the previous seminar. Karnap sees the task of providing explications as in line. He doesn't claim that's something quite new with him. He says that explications are quite, in line with what other earlier philosophers, analytic philosophers, did. And in fact, in Meaning and Necessity, he lists 3 or more models for explication that reveal where he's coming from. For example, first, he talks about Frege and Russell's analysis of natural numbers, where the explicandum is the term, quote unquote, 2, is not the exact meaning, is a concept that's used in everyday discourse, even in applied mathematics, but meaning is quite vague. And to be replaced by an explicatum, that's the class of pair classes, for example, as introduced by Frege and Russell. Secondly, Frege and Russell's other work on different descriptions, which contains the phrases like something is so and so, something is this and so, and this is as the explicandum, and this is replaced by various interpretation of descriptions that was provided by Frege and Russell. We'll not go into the details of this various interpretation. Just for the sake of clarity, we are talking about different kinds of explicatums that there are for Karnap. And thirdly, Tarski's account of truth, where the explicandum is the concept of truth that's used in everyday language, and all in everyday language and by traditional and modern logic, and the explicatum would be the semantic theory of truth that was eloquently developed by Tarski in his T-schemata, if you are familiar with it. And these 3 paradigmatic examples for Karnap comes from logic and the foundations of mathematics. But for Karnap, he says another layer should be added to these examples. That philosophy should also model itself on natural sciences, and this involves the transition that we talked about in the previous seminar. When he talks about the pre-scientific concept of fish, or which was transformed into a new zoological notion, which I do not know how to pronounce it, and other examples like NaCl. Okay, now, beyond this brief characterization, I want to talk about the 4 requirements of explication, which were also discussed in the previous seminar. So an explicatum has to satisfy 4 requirements to a sufficient degree, quote unquote, sufficient degree. That is the phrase that Karnap uses. Firstly, the explicatum has to be similar to the explicandum in a such a way that, in most cases in which this explicandum has to be used just the way the explicatum can be used. And I think, and this is what can be called, the similarity condition. And I think, this similarity condition should not be interpreted in terms of extensions of explicanda and explicata. The extensional, the referential, whatever you can call it, not the extensional description of explicanda and explicata. Rather, I think it should be better construed. You should better construe this similarity functionally, as the functional role performed by an explicatum in a suitable theoretical framework, for example, which was previously performed by the corresponding explicandum. So, an example, we might talk about and explicate the concept proposition. The concept of proposition can be given a lot of explicata, but one of them, for the sake of argument, you can say the concept can be explicated in terms of sets of possible wells. And the reason why I think it's not this similarity condition should not be defined extensionally is because you could explicate propositions in terms of a set of possible wells without believing in the extension of the proposition that could have possible wells. The set of possible wells are only introduced functionally, not necessarily extensionally. You are not a model realist like David Lewis if you believe in sets of possible wells, which is an explicata for the explicandum proposition. So the concepts are here similar in the sense that the explicatum that was introduced performs the same function as the explicandum. Secondly, the explicatum has to be precise, or at least more precise than the explicandum, as we talked about, in virtue of explicit rules of use or explicit rules of definition given in the well-constructed, well-connected system of concepts. Thirdly, explicatum has to be fruitful in the sense that it facilitates the formulation of many universal statements, empirical laws in the case of science, and logical theorems in the case of logical concepts. Fourthly, the explicatum has to be simple, which I think is a quite straightforward and non-problematic requirement. These 4 requirements are satisfied, as follows. In an example, you can replace, the 4 concept of warm with a quantitative concept, temperature. Firstly, the similarity condition. In most cases, when we say that something is warmer than X is warmer than Y, according to our sensation, you can explicate in terms of the temperature of X is being greater than the temperature of Y. Second, precision. The rules of use for temperature can be precisely defined with reference, for example, to thermometers. Thirdly, fruitfulness. Temperature the concept temperature, the explicata temperature, can be used in many laws in science. For example, in the ideal gas law of physics. And fourth, simplicity. Both the rules for temperature and the laws that temperatures used in are quite simple compared, maybe they are quite simple compared to other alternative theories that we have for temperature, for example. You know, in light of such considerations, I think Karnap says, you know, temperature can be an explicator of warm or cold, and it's quite important for science. Another, you know, important concept I want to talk about with regards to these four requirements, which will be important in the later slides, is that, you know, Karnap typically is construed, I don't know whether truthfully or not, in terms of interpretation of his work, that he has prioritized fruitfulness over similarity and other requirements. And he plays favorites with regards to these requirements. And I want to highlight, you know, why this favoritism of Karnap could be problematic in some sense. You know, here we can bring up the first distinction that we made between conceptual amelioration or conceptual and conceptual engineering in explicating the concept of warm. And this, you know, either you choose conceptual amelioration or conceptual engineering would depend on your own aims. For example, if your aim is the improvement of concepts in the service of, you know, logical, mathematical, and empirical concepts, then you have to prioritize fruitfulness over similarity. So, because, you know, you don't care about the similarity because you want to get away from the folk concept, and you want to construct a new concept, and the sole desiderata, the sole requirement for you would be fruitfulness, and you will prioritize fruitfulness over similarity. Okay, so the second, in contrast to that, if you want, you know, to you only want to shed some new light on some unclear concepts, by introducing a new concept that will just correspond to the folk concept, the previous, the explicanda concept. You are here trying to prioritize similarity over fruitfulness. You know, from this, and so the difference between this amelioration and engineering would be that you are prioritizing some requirements over others, and we will see why this distinction will be important for us. Okay, at the beginning, you know, I said that. Sorry, am I the right here? At the beginning, I said, you know, that explication can be defined as anti-philosophy and anti-philosophy through and through. And I think this is the angle from which Peter Strawson would target Carnapian explication, and Peter Strawson would be the major influence of the seminar. For Strawson, firstly, you know, you have to talk about the central problem that he talks about in regards to Carnapian explication. The central type of philosophical problem that Strawson, Peter Strawson, the later Strawson, not the younger Strawson, his son, the advocate of panpsychism, no, not that guy, the older guy, Peter Strawson. The central type of philosophical problem that, you know, Peter Strawson wants to highlight is, he says, this kind of problems deal with paradoxes and perplexities. You know, for example, it happens that, you know, when you are reflecting on a certain kind of concept, on your armchair, you find that yourself to be driven to adopt a certain kind of view or position that seems quite paradoxical and quite unacceptable. For example, you know, external world skepticism, you know, from arguments from illusion or from the nature of sensory experience. And we typically respond to this kind of conceptual dysfunction or conceptual imbalance to solve it or resolve it or dissolve it, whatever way you like it. So this is the typical philosophical argument or problem that arises from traditional philosophy, which uses folk concepts or some sort of refined concept of analytic metaphysics, for example. You know, concepts like the world or experience or knowledge. For Strawson, these concepts that are used are everyday discourse. These are the kind of concepts that actually give rise to this set of philosophical problems. But those who are introduced in scientific context for example, for their fruitfulness or whatever goal that you have in mind, they have a narrow purpose. They simply do not give rise to the kind of particular set of philosophical problems that he's talking about. So this is the first problem of explication. The first problem is this. If we seek to use Carnapian full explication, we differentiate between partial and full explication. If we use the Carnapian full explication to resolve the above mentioned, philosophical problem, we thereby, replace the concept used to formulate these philosophical problems with a concept that's designed to be useful for science. Well, that's the difference. You replace a useful concept, which is useful for science, with a concept that was previously used as a philosophical problem, like external skepticism. But Strawson says, this simply changed the subject. We are simply changing the subject because there is simply no alignment between what I want when I'm talking about philosophical problems and what the scientist wants when he prioritizes the fruitfulness criteria for his explicata. As we said previously, that the third condition is the similarity condition, that it should be defined functionally as a functional role played by the explicatum in place of the explicandum. Part of Strawson's thought here is that given that the use of language in science is quite narrow, the scientific concept is quite narrow, the purposes of science are quite narrow, and the ordinary language purposes are quite broad and has a variety of uses in everyday discourse. The concepts that that are introduced in science are actually serving a narrow purpose compared to this broad purpose of ordinary discourse. That's to say, when we define even the explicatum functionally. So the narrowness of the functions of the explicatum simply cannot just align itself with the motley of the functional uses of ordinary discourse. So the functional pluralism of ordinary discourse cannot align with the functional conservatism of scientific discourse. If that's the case, then you cannot show there is some sort of isomorphism or correspondence between the functions of these two different branches. You cannot even talk about the similarity condition at all, let alone a sufficient degree of similarity, as Karnap talks about. Hence, the explication for Strawson is quite irrelevant, since there is no functional isomorphism or correspondence between the explicandum and explicatum. The language of science cannot simply supplant the language of drawing rooms or the language of culinary arts or the language of kitchen or the language of court. So I think these two kinds of arguments are directed. You have to make it clear that these two kinds of argument, the changing subject argument and the irrelevance argument, are quite separate. One of them is directed against partial explication, the other against full explication. Okay, by way of previous example, Strawson talks about, Karnap's example of warmth and temperature. He says, that our sensory concepts that have a rich source of philosophical perplexity. For example, he used some simple examples. When he says, when you talk about the sensory experiences or sensory awareness of two people, does it follow that from the fact that, for example, we have the sensory experience of the same object, but for me it can feel warm, but for you it can feel cold. That in an object that's really neither cold nor warm, and maybe does not have any kind of warm or cold property. So such questions can be answered, or the fact that there is some sort of dissimilarity or disalignment between my experience, sensory awareness of the coldness and warmness, and your sensory awareness of coldness and warmness cannot, this kind of difficulties, conceptual perplexities and problems that we talked or that we defined in the previous slides cannot simply be solved or resolved or dissolved by formal exercises of scientific concepts like, you know, temperature, wavelength, energy, frequency, whatever. So, and if you try to replace, you know, warm and cold and any other kind of related concepts with a scientifically fruitful concept, which is called temperature, it can be fruitful nonetheless. You know, Strawson does not, you know, evade explication altogether, but he says, you know, because scientifically useful concept does not actually give rise to this kind of problems, philosophical problems. You know, the dissimilarity between my experience of cold and your experience of cold that has no kind of, that has no isomorphism with the actual object that has a quantitative level of the temperature, because there's no isomorphism between them. You cannot simply claim that you can replace one by another. You cannot simply replace the explicata, the explicandum by the explicata. Okay, you know, an argument by analogy can be used to save the similarity condition, the first condition that we talked about. You know, as the answer to the changing subject criticism. You know, when Strawson talks about, you know, when there's no similarity condition between, because of the diversity of uses in ordinary discourse, there's no similarity between the scientific uses and the folk uses of a given concept. He charges this with the changing of subject criticism. And there is some sort of response that can be given by some sort of, you know, by an argument from analogy. You know, a number of authors have actually used this kind of criticism against Strawson in the following lines. You know, suppose that we are interested in a concept called this concept C, and this concept C has a property F. And the question mark indicates that, you know, we are unable to determine this question directly. We don't know whether this concept has a property F because the concept is vague or whatever. It's unclear. It does not have explicit rules. Then we might try to explicate C, resulting in the explicatum C, which is the C prime. You know, given this C prime is more precise than C, we might be able to establish, you know, for example, you can say f of C prime. You know, the C prime now has the property C, because we try to explicate the explicandum, which was C, with a new concept, which is C prime. Then, by pointing out the similarity between C and C prime, we might argue, you know, that by analogy, you know, the similarity condition is here is saved or salvaged by some sort of analogy. You can say then f of C. So the S is determined, the S, you know, the vague concept, the explicandum, is determined retrospectively by the explicated C prime. So the similarity condition has been met, and we have explicated the similarity condition. But, you know, I have a problem here. You know, if one uses this, you know, and we please take this in mind, that, you know, when you talk about similarity condition as being more fundamental, we are talking about partial explication. Therefore, this is an argument against partial explication, not full-fledged Karnapian explication. So if you use this, you know, and as an example of partial explication to solve the philosophical problem that we talked about, you know, the dissimilarity between sensory awareness and sensory experience of my warmth and your coldness, and what this argument from analogy can achieve is only FC. You know, FC can be explicated by FC prime. But it seems, you know, if you try to retrospectively construct FC, which was the vague concept, out of the explicated concept. You started with the explicated one, the C prime. Then you tried by analogy, try to show that there is similarity with the vague concept. And this, but ultimately you seem to be leaving out the to me part and the to you part. This part cannot be, cannot be explicated, but can be explained by ordinary language. So this seems to be a step extra beyond the explication part, because to explain, not explicate, to explain is to accurately describe certain mode of functioning of the given non-constructed explicandum of the folk concept. Simply put, if there is a pathology, namely ambiguity related to the folk concept, which is the explicandum, then we have to have a precise delineation or definition of not only the pathology, which is the ambiguity, but also the physiology of the explicandum, which is, or we could say, what a non-ambiguous explicandum would look like. So by just setting aside the to me part and the to you part is not illumination, it's just desertion. Finally, as I said again, this is an argument against partial explication, not the full-fledged Karnap explication, which we'll deal with it in the late slides. Okay, we said previously that replacing the philosophical problems with fruitful concepts simply changes the subject. The philosophical puzzles and problems that we face. If you say a simple magic bullet, which is useful concepts, can solve our problem. This is simply changing the subject, according to Strawson, and this kind of full replacement is the start of criticism of the full-fledged Karnap explication. And it's informative to start with a quote from Karnap, when he says, a natural language is like a crude, primitive pocket knife, very useful for 100 different purposes. But for a certain specific purposes, special tools are more efficient. Example: chisels, cutting machines, and finally microtome. Microtome is the microscopic cutting machine that's used by in medical laboratories. If we find that the pocket knife is too crude for a given purpose and creates defective products, we shall try to discover the causes of failure, the failure, and then either use the knife more skillfully or replace it with this special purpose by a more suitable tool, or even invent a new one. Strawson's thesis is like saying that by using a special tool, we evade the problem of the correct use of the cruder tool. But would anyone criticize the bacteriologist for using a microtome and assert that he's evading the problem correctly by using a pocket knife? Of course not. No one would criticize the bacteriologist for using a microtome. I think there are two brief points to be made here in response to Karnap. First, Strawson actually does not deny that explication per se can be useful for us for illuminating, for example, not necessarily solving, maybe solving philosophical problems. He accepts that, and he actually says, this partial explication, what he calls, actually calls the partial explication rational reconstruction, which was the earlier version of Karnap, Karnap's explication.
So sorry to interrupt. Is there much more to go? Just because we are a little bit tight on time today.
Sorry, no, yeah, only 2 slides.
Okay. I mean, if you can wrap it up in the next minute or two, that would be.
Yeah. I'll do. Okay. So what I want to highlight here is that you could give 2 arguments against Karnap's here. For example, you could say that an explication could be useful could be useful for our purposes, but no knowledge is gained about pocket knives by replacing it with microtomes, because to know about pocket knives is to know about pocket knives. Microtomes will not illuminate any kind of new knowledge about pocket knives. And replacement requires some sort of antecedent knowledge about explication, which I'll discuss in the next slide. Few words. We said, as we said earlier, if you don't want to give an antecedent explanation of the ordinary concept or idea, you are simply deciding in advance whether this kind of concepts will be fully explicated, and you will have a deeper problem here, because you are just simply talking past each other. And I think this revisionary view of full-fledged Karnapian explication, as radical conceptual revision of everyday discourse, has a problem of fixing reference. How can we be sure that references preserved across even different explications between a Carnapian and a post-Carnapian explicators, let alone between a Carnapian and a Strawsonian? Of course, I'm not talking about reference here in the crazy sense of truth makers and stuff. I'm just talking about, the banal idea that we are talking about the same thing as two interlocutors that we are not just simply cross-talking with each other. Finally, this is an example of that J.L. Austin uses as an example of the richness and complexity of everyday discourse. And the example involves shooting donkeys, but because I don't have time, I'll not talk about it. Thank you.
Dilshad, magnificent presentation. I actually, to be honest with you, I was really, this is just like you are giving us all this stuff just to bring us to the shooting donkeys. And then right at the moment, which is critical, important stuff, you say that, sorry, I'm going to cut it off without even saying what shooting donkeys entails. Thank you so much, though.